Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Ascended Casual back again with another Neo 2 video. Now, I'm going to be flying through a bunch of this stuff because you guys cannot believe how many times I've had to re-record this due to timing issues and so on and so forth. So pretty much what this video is going to be is, pretty much what the title is going to be, the most comprehensive Neo 2 video. And really, we're just going to be kind of going through every single little thing. You can find a lot of videos out there talking into things, into really great in depth, into everything specifically. However, there are some things that when I was new and I was playing this game and I was looking at all those videos, looking up all the guides, that I felt like weren't necessarily explained very well, or advice that I wish I had gotten. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing in this game that's going to like make or break anything. You're not going to make some horrible decision where you use something or you didn't get something at the right time or whatever, and now the whole no, nothing like that even remotely exists in the game, though it may feel like it. But without further ado, let's just get into it. First thing obviously we're going to do is we're just going to start on this list and go all the way down the way. But before we actually get into that, I do want to talk about some gameplay mechanics and things that I feel like are important. So unlike other Souls-like games, typically you would dodge away from your opponent and so on and so forth. And while I have a lot of agility in this game and a lot of ki, and obviously I'm in the dojo, so I have unlimited ki, typically your best bet when fighting enemies is actually dodging into your opponents. 9 times out of 10, the safest option is actually dodging into attacks, because one, that's just how it works. I don't know how to explain it other than it is the safer option. And two, it's very advantageous for you to be behind your opponent because attacking them in the back does more damage to them. So there's very, 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 very rare instances where that's not the correct, thing to do. But I think as a general rule of thumb, you can rely on dodging into your opponents as the safer move than trying to dodge away where they might chase you down or swing sideways and you get hit by a sideways attack. Other than that, let's get into it. So regarding weapons, I know you're going to see a lot of things on this character that are not going to match up with what I'm saying specifically. Don't mind that, because I recently started playing this game on PC, and I beat the game, and now I also play on Cheat Engine, so it allows me to play around with things that I normally wouldn't be able to, and have kind of like a deeper perspective on things. But for the purposes of this, just ignore what my equipment says, but do not focus on things that increase damage. There are certain effects that try and increase damage. However, I was able to play the game with a level 1 common weapon, common in rarity, white, or whatever you want to call it, and I never felt like there's a point in time where I was not doing enough damage. And I believe that you get a lot more mileage, one, with just knowing how to play the game, know how to fight your opponents, and the stats that you get from leveling up, than you do, trying to really max out the damage on a particular weapon. I know that sounds counterintuitive because I have an ethereal weapon that does 3,000 damage, and if you're just starting this game, you're not doing anywhere near that damage. But I'm talking about when I played on PC and I was going through Dream of the Samurai and I was playing with a level 1 weapon, I was able to kill everything all the way through Dream of the Samurai with no problems, the level 1 weapon, and I was typically like 20 levels under what I needed to be, and we'll get into that later. I would focus on, instead of trying to increase your damage, have effects that increase your quality of life. Things that like reduce your ki consumption, things that do more ki damage. Ki damage is a form of damage that is, viable rather than just raw damage, or things that increase your status acclamation on your opponent. Those I will prioritize rather than just trying to increase your raw attack damage, because it never really goes all that far and it becomes a wasted special slot when you could have things that could make your experience so much easier. And think about it like this: if you could only swing your weapon, one time for 3,000 damage, or 3,100 damage, or you could swing your sword like 2 or 3 times for just 3,000 damage, the 2 or 3 times is going to total up to way more than just one time, right? So focus on quality of life. Other thing with the longbow, and when it comes to bows and rifles, of course, bows have the benefit of having effects from the ninjutsu skill tree, and they're also silent. However, I remember one time I was trying to farm a specific enemy, and even though my bow does almost 1,000 more damage, I would always one-shot them with a headshot with the rifle, but not the longbow, and I couldn't figure it out why. And that's because rifles come with an inherent piercing effect. So I would highly recommend when you have a bow to get the piercing effect. That should be a big priority effect that you get, and I'm pretty sure it's not super duper rare and hard to get. So you aren't going to be getting too many effects that try and increase, damage power on your armor, so you don't have to worry about that much. But again, kind of same thing. Focus on quality of life stuff, and you're going to notice I have certain effects, especially if you're playing this game from the beginning. Effects that have stars next to it. There's a lot of effects and things that will not show up until you start getting into the later new game plus. And a lot of things that exist in the game don't make sense without those effects. So I am a firm believer that this game was built backwards, essentially. So there's going to be a lot of things in the game that kind of just seem like they're there, but it'll make sense once you get into those later stages of the game, which I do highly recommend, because that's when you really start getting to be able to, get cool effects and being able to do a whole bunch of cool stuff. And it really isn't that hard, especially if you're following my advice that I'm giving you. But in terms of effects, still same thing with your accessories and your scrolls. I will say, if you look at effects that do not have any number or letter percentage next to it, in this case, enemy sensor or faster wind of recovery or sloth and ninjutsu hit, that is a very easy way to see that effect does not stack with anything. So do not try and put multiple of that effect on multiple different types of items, because you're going to be wasting slots. Next, we'll go into the items. I will say, do not be afraid to use items. I remember for a long time, I was so afraid to use my Tengu fans and all these other stuff, because I thought that there was going to be a point in the game where it was going to be really useful, and that time never came. And I got through all the way through Dream of the Nioh before I realized, hey, I could have just been using this stuff. Don't be afraid to use your stuff. When it comes to certain things that give you buffs, I would say use these as much as the game drops them. I like to have it at max in my inventory, and if something drops, slow down, look actually what you're picking up, because if it drops something like, sake or your sacred water or anything that gives you some kind of buff state, it is much more useful for you to use the one in your inventory to bring your max number down, and then pick the one up in your on the ground to go back up to max in your inventory. Because if you were to pick it up while you're at max inventory, it'll go automatically to your storehouse, which means you will not be able to use it in the level that you're in. So the game throws these kind of things at you: sake, sacred water, salt, and bombs. Make sure you're actually using them, and especially things like ninjutsu bombs or the gunpowder bombs, because these contribute to your ninjutsu skill and proficiency to allow you to get more proficiency with them. And if you're not using these, then you're really just in any encounter, you should be trying to engage your opponent at distance at first, unless you think you're going to one-shot them, from a sneak attack or whatever. But you should always be trying to get a hit or two off at distance before you engage anything. And these are a good way to both do that as well as level up your ninjutsu. For Amyo, in the beginning, you're going to have to rely on these amulets. They give you any kind of shooting type Amyo. You'll use these amulets until you start getting enough Amyo proficiency to actually get those other kinds of skills to help you level up. But in terms of these kinds of things, I usually try and only have about half of my max inventory in my inventory at any given time. So if I go load into a map and I have 11, I'm using 6 or 7 on the spot. That's because sometimes some enemies will drop multiples, 3 or 4 at a time. And again, if you have anywhere near your max, then the extras are going to shuffle off into your vault and you won't be able to use them. You'll be able to know the difference between what will and won't level up your proficiencies by what you can actually get in your skill tree. So if we go to ninja, first thing on the left is a gunpowder bomb. There are certain items that you can get that are not going to level up your proficiency, in which case my advice is just use them. Use them, they're useful, they'll help, you fight, opponents and make the game easier for you. The game gives you plenty, so don't be afraid to use them. And yeah, when it comes to soul cores, the big thing that I haven't really seen anyone really talk about is pay attention to what the yokai ability actually does. Some yokai abilities, like the Yamanba, if you look at the animation, doesn't really seem like it does much, but if you come down to the yokai ability, it actually gives you an attack increase, buff temporarily. Now, like I said, I wouldn't focus on too much on trying to increase your attack, but it's better than, some quick attack or whatever. Ippon Dadara is very, very useful, but there are a lot of other, ones that probably aren't as useful. Like things like Karasu and Enki just give you probably a little bit of invincibility, not because you're actually invincible, because you get up so high in the air that most enemies can't really hit you. Very few actually can. But look at what the yokai abilities actually do. One of my favorite is the Shuten Doji, because it actually gives you extraction and Pleiades, which really benefits each other. Not to mention the extraction allows you to get Amrita from attacking your opponents even normally. And one of the base effects in this is increased defense on Amrita absorption. So you can automatically, just from the soul core, get 3 effects, let alone if you have any other kind of items that give you any other kind of buffs from Amrita absorption. You can get a lot more just for the low cost of 5 anima. Not to mention it can inflict your opponent with Scorched, which if they're inflicted with any other kind of element, then they're also get confused along with that other element in Scorch now. Very useful. Just make sure you're paying attention to what they actually do. Fragments, I made a video in the past where I talked about having a certain many of Umbracite. So as I explained in the beginning of this video, you don't really need to worry about too much about trying to max out the damage of your gear and so on and so forth. And in that same vein, I would not worry about trying to upgrade your gear. Now, in the past, I made a video where I talked about how a lot of YouTubers will say it's not important at all. And in that video, I talked about, no, it's actually important. You should do it. I've kind of backpedaled from that a little bit, where I believe it is not important, not as important as I was making it seem. I just would not feel so compelled to spend all of your money and all your resources trying to level everything up all the time. I would definitely focus more on defense, if anything, than attack. But if I recommend anything, it would be disassemble your rare or blue down to your common or white throughout the game. Sell your exotics, which are purples, and then once you start getting divine gear, disassemble those, because once you get multiple new game pluses, you will eventually get to the point where you can craft divine umbracite, which will greatly speed up your ability to temper the effects that you want on gear, especially if you want to start multiple builds. It is not like oh dang it, I didn't do this, it's all ruined. This will just save you a lot of time in the future. But again, you get this from disassembling, getting umbracite fragments, which you get from disassembling rare to common items, which are of course very easy and common that you get those. Divine obviously is a little less frequent, but you still get those pretty frequently. It'll just save you a lot more time in the future, because once you have divine umbracite, you can get all the other different types of umbracite effects, but lower umbracite quality does not scale upwards. You cannot use umbracite to get quality fabled or divine umbracite effects. So it'll just save you a lot of time. It is not going to be the end of the world if you don't do that. That is just my recommendation for you. What is next? Guardian Spirits. The biggest thing that I have about Guardian Spirits is people will say Brute is the easiest to use, and that's true, but sometimes there are burst attacks that are too fast to be burst countered with the Brute unless you predicted the attack before it happened. So while the brute is the easiest to use, sometimes it is not going to be something that you're going to be able to time if you're trying to react after the opponent, starts their burst attack. Feral gives you a little bit more time because now you're actually waiting for the attack to hit you and you're dodging, your burst countering into it, and it gives you a little bit of iframes, but it isn't the safest. Phantom is the hardest to time because it acts like a perfect guard, but it is also the safest because it also acts as a block. So even if you don't time it right, you are kind of blocking. So it's the hardest to time, but the most safe, and obviously a little bit easier to time, but less safe, and even easier, but the least safe. Going forward, learning skills, I would recommend throughout the game, you're going to get proficiency that's going to allow you to unlock these skills. At the same time, you're also eventually going to start unlocking locks of skills that will allow you to instantly get skill points to learn stuff. I would hold on to those locks until the number of skills that you have left overlap with the amount of locks that you have, because if you use those locks early, the amount of proficiency that you need to unlock the next skill is going to increase, thus making it take longer for you to get those skills. I remember I saw in the last video that there's a setting that you could put your setting on to use the locks immediately. I would turn that off or keep that off because it is only going to make it take longer for you. I would just pull open your skill tree, skill list, count how many skills that you're actually looking to get, and then keep that number in mind every time you actually organically get a skill. Reduce that number. Anytime you get a lock, increase that number, and then once those two numbers overlap, then just get the rest of the skills all in one go. Another thing about skills, do not ignore the passives. I know we'll look at the skill moves, and those will be our biggest priorities, but typically, most people, unless you really, really, really practice and you just like being fancy, most of us aren't really using every single one of our skills. The passives are hugely important to being able to survive because they do things like allow you to take less damage, allow you to recover ki a lot faster, and it allows you to, do more damage when you're at certain points of health, and so on and so forth. There are in each skill tree these that increase your attack plus whatever. These need to be the absolute last ones that you're getting, because what that means by attack plus 2, if we go back to my weapon and look at it, all that would mean is that would take my 3,168 damage to 3,170. That damage increase is so small and not noticeable that it would be a waste of a skill versus you going off of the passives that give you percent increases versus just a flat damage, increase by 2, so to speak. So keep that in mind. And then we back up a little bit, since we already went over guardian spirits. When it comes to soul cores, and we talked about items and using them as you pick them up, you are going to get these things called lantern plant fruits and red spider lilies. It is typically advised to have one of those, soul cores that give you some kind of buff. The way that I would use these, similar to something like sacred water, would be if I find one of these on the ground, I would use the soul core that gives me the buff, use one of these to get my anima back, and then pick it up. So I would max that out back into my inventory. The game constantly gives you stuff like, I would say the most frequently it gives you is sacred water, salt, and gunpowder bombs. Salts are extremely useful against yokai because it helps immediately break their stamina. And actually, I'm about to go into one of the most important things in this game, something that I found out recently, is these feathers. So in the past, I created a YouTube video about your ninjing wrong and the different ways to play ninja, all centered around the concept of survivability, and that concept still holds true. However, I definitely underestimated how powerful these scrolls are, these feather art, shadow arts with the feathers. It does say it directly on the thing that they do a lot of damage when the opponent's out of ki. However, I definitely underestimated how much damage these things do. These things do like ridiculous amounts of damage. And I'm talking about ridiculous amounts of damage, and I didn't have any kinds of effects that increased ninjutsu power at all, save for like the prestige points from getting titles and stuff like that. And I was like, with 2 or 3 of these, I was killing bosses when I would get their, stamina all the way down. I don't believe that there should be any build that, like, unless you're specifically trying to go like a non-ninjutsu build, every build should be using these. I've always gotten more mileage out of these than the supposedly larger one. Perhaps it might be because these are probably most useful against extremely large yokai, but for some reason I've always gotten way more damage out of these specifically. Um, yeah, and you have things in here like shuriken, and they're like, what do I do with these? Like, these seem so like random. I don't understand why anybody would use these kinds of things. And like I said, in the beginning of the game, most of these things don't have any real use. However, you get to the point where you start getting effects that inflict sloth on ninjutsu hits. So something like a shuriken that is very cheap, very quick, and is very useful when applying those kinds of effects to help slow your enemy down and help you take advantage of the thing. I have on my PC where I can, just give myself whatever effects I want, probably like 5 different types of debuffs and buffs on ninjutsu hit, and being able to just get all of those off on a single shuriken hit makes the game extremely trivial. But you're probably not going to be able to get that unless you also have the cheat engine. But regardless, that is what these are for. Like I said, the game is built backwards. Going down to Nioh, the way I look at some of these skills are these kinds that kind of cast, spell at your opponent. These are for leveling up your, Nioh. These are for increasing your proficiency. The real bread and butter of what's called the Nioh skill tree are the self buffs, like the familiar talismans. You have your fire and you have your lightning ones. These are great at applying buffs, especially, lightning will give a reduced movement effect, and if you have a sloth on Nioh hit, then that doubles down. I like to try and have so many effects that I don't have to have different types of jutsu, and I can conserve jutsu because there is a sloth talisman in here. So instead of having that sloth talisman, I can have sloth on Nioh hit, so any of my Nioh spells will cause sloth, and then I'll combine it with something else that'll also reduce the movement of my opponents. One of the biggest and most powerful Nioh spells is actually this one when combined with a yokai weapon. When the yokai weapon is fully awakened, it will do a similar wind blast of corruption, but when combined with this, it'll send 2, which will absolutely shred through opponents' armors and defense and their stamina and their ki, making it so that, most enemies really can't deal with this, and if they run out of ki, like I said, you could go back and you can hit them with your ninja scroll. I did talk about in the ninja video about how Danzo Kato will use this. He'll drop a smoke ball and then start launching these, and I tried to relate how to actually play with these in comparison to how the NPCs will use them. What I would always do is anytime I would find a dark realm, I would use my catwalking and sneak thief, go find the yokai that's releasing the dark realm, beat them, and then all of the yokai would be temporarily stunned. If they were aggro to me, I'd probably drop a smoke ball to make them all, lose aggro on me, maybe hit another sneak thief. And then typically most yokai stay in a perpetual ki deprived state or ki depleted state, and you can one-shot them with these and just clear the whole yokai realm, which they will not come back because of the dark realm that they're in. And yeah, status, the only thing that I have about this is be careful with the lettered what's called abilities and stats, because they cap out at AAA. So if you come here and you see a specific stat is already at AAA plus, don't keep putting into it. It does have a hard cap, while the percentages have more of a soft cap, just because of the fact that you only can have so high percentages on so many different items. But just don't waste that. I'm pretty sure I'm not remembering something. Tea utensils are really great at selling. That can be a really good source of, gold. But you really don't need to be buying stuff for the most part. But other than that, thanks for listening. Talk to you guys later. See ya. Bye.